Okay, so am I clear, this is the policy decision and this is the implementers?
These are our staff or the elected members of the board.
Okay, thank you.
You know that Andy joined
Yeah,
us.
so I want to talk about emissions and also mitigation. And when I was young, World War II, I was in a classroom with 44 kids, and I was the only person in the classroom who had not lost my tonsils because my mother refused. Everybody lost their tonsils. Okay, today the medical establishment says unless the child has had 7 bouts of tonsillitis or strep within a year, or 5 in 2 successive years, tonsillectomy is not recommended. And even then it qualifies, but it has to be verified that these cases happen by doctors, not just parent report, and it's still questionable. So tonsils removals was hugely popular. Now it's basically gone except for a few special cases. Similarly, in the 1920s, we began everybody believing in something called the superiority of native vegetation. Okay, and it was everywhere. It's floating around in your draft management plan, the one that we're working on, whether or not we should be removing non-native trees, because the inherent idea that they're superior, they're less flammable, they're more likely to keep things under control. So I want to point out that that's the idea that non-native plants and trees should be removed is really very questionable. It's going out of date, like removing tonsils. Okay? And in terms of emissions, every time you cut down a tree, there's an incredible amount of emissions. You don't have it in this comprehensive survey. Nevertheless, it is created. Carbon goes into the air. If you decide to replace those trees, why you would, I don't know. But you take out a huge tree and you put in a 15-gallon, it's going to take an awful lot of years before it absorbs that much carbon. So I would just like to suggest that part of trying to be friendly to preventing climate change, you really should consider not taking out healthy trees that are Forest Department, Forestry Service, whatever, are apparently not doing harm right now. It's still arguable, but I think it's an outdated thing like tonsillectomies. And you should use those same funds to build more trees, to put in more trees. You know, part of the elephant in the room is the huge amount of acreage you have up there where you could be planting trees, which would be extremely helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Do you know instances where we're taking out large healthy trees? I'm sorry.
You know, this year I haven't been able to find out. The draft management plan, I guess, is in flux, and it no longer talks about, previously it talked about removing eucalyptus and pines. It was your policy, and we're doing that. Okay, at this point, the draft thing is kind of, they've changed to saying taking out hazardous trees, trees that are fire hazard, which bends back to that, enhancing the environment, which my understanding usually means that you take out non-native things and you put in native things, and that's a very questionable idea. As a matter of fact, it's kind of been shown that the environment does best mostly when nature's allowed to provide what works there, what functions, okay, as opposed to something that is no longer functioning or functions less well.
Thank you.
I can answer that question about the specifics.
We really, as I said, this is not, we can't do the discussion here. What I would encourage and what I will ask Alex or Mike to do, the people to talk to about our watershed management program in terms of trees aren't here. It's usually held covered in our planning committee, but we can direct you to Richard Sykes or another appropriate staff.
And put you in touch with the right person. But
No, this is the right place. I'm not going to go on and on. I'm just going to say I saw about a year and a half ago 50 healthy trees cut down in the space of 2 days at the corner of Grizzly Peak and by the steam trains. And some of those trees were 2-3 feet in diameter.
I'm not sure that's our land.
Yeah, the steam trains would be part of it.
It was East Bay Mudland. I checked.
Not in Tilden Park.
I checked. It was East Bay Mudland because yes, I know it was East Bay Mudland.
I have a question. I wanted to know Is East Bay Mud now sort of taking over the cutting of the trees because the other FEMA has cut off the funding from the other organizations for cutting trees? Is that why East Bay
Sure.
Mud is busy doing
Yeah,
this?
let's provide an update on our watershed management plan and our tree program. And try to be brief, because I recognize we have a lot of speakers for the next item, and we are scheduled to end at 10.
So, very briefly, East Bay Mud has had a long practice of removing understory and selectively removing invasive trees to protect against hazards and fire. For more than 20 years, we've been the example that many people have pointed to of how to balance maintaining a good, healthy ecosystem with fire prevention. Other communities, Oakland, UC Berkeley, have been working for a long time. They were advocating for a clear-cut approach, which is not East Bay Mud's approach. And so they met refusal, and only recently they've completed necessary environmental documentation to allow them to move forward and begin removing trees at a much greater pace than they have been able to do in the past. So what you're seeing, the great majority of what you're seeing in the way of tree removal is being done by either Oakland or the UC system.
They're clearing to build a campus up there, the Hill campus. It's not the right reason, it makes no sense. I mean,
So we have 6 speakers scheduled. Everybody has 3 minutes, and we have a presentation that I think you will find quite helpful in your understanding. What I would like to do is have the presentation precede public comments on the pest management item. Thank you.
Chandra Johansson, who manages our environmental compliance office, is going to provide the presentation.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chandra Johansson. I work in the environmental compliance section here at the district, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning to share some of the specific details on the district's integrated pest management program, also called the IPM program. I understand this is an issue that's important for many, so I'm hopeful that the information contained herein is going to be able to provide some answers to some of the questions you have. Just to keep things moving, because I know we do have some time constraints here. The flow this morning, I'd like to walk through IPM, how we use it on a day-to-day basis as we're implementing it here. Some of the highlights of the program, the phased approach, the things and the critical thought that goes into the program. We'll go over some pesticide information, application information from the year 2015. We had an opportunity to vet some of that data, so we'll share some of those statistics with you. Touch on staff training and qualification for those folks that do pesticide application here at the district. Go over some policies that are out there as it relates to IPM, answer any questions on that, and then talk about next steps going forward. We have some recommendations to continue to further enhance the program, and so we'd like to discuss those with you. So square one, the first step is really defining what a pest is. So there's a couple of different things here. So the term pest refers to organisms that have the potential to bring nuisance or hazard. It can include everything from insects, rodents, weeds, vegetation, those sorts of things that have the ability to kind of interact and cause challenge with our day-to-day operations at various facilities. So that's just kind of square one, understanding what a pest is and defining what a pest is. The next phase is to talk about where we need to manage these pests, where we need to implement some controls. So here at East Bay Mud, there's kind of 3 distinct areas where IPM is being implemented. So first up is our watershed, our open space lands. So we have roughly 28,000 acres of watershed space here in the East Bay, and a similarly sized watershed up in the upcountry areas as well. So watershed is comprised of 2 major categories. You've got your open space areas, those big open rolling hills, and then you've also got your rec areas. Some of you may have been out to Lafayette Reservoir, San Paulo Reservoir, those areas where we have designated recreation. And those areas have different needs and constraints, and they have to be managed in different ways because they're uniquely different. We also have our Aqueduct right away, so we have roughly 126 miles of linear pipeline and associated facilities and appurtenances related to the aqueduct, where those areas also have to be maintained, the infrastructure has to be accessible, and so there's IPM practiced out in that zone too. Lastly, we actually have our facilities that are related to operations as well as administration. So for here in the East Bay, for example, we've got water treatment plants, pumping plants, all sorts of different facilities, and then administrative would be something like this building here. So IPM is practiced and utilized at all of these different types of facilities, and you can imagine the variability between, say, managing a space like this and managing open space. So that's what we're talking about. So now we know what a pest is. We know the types of areas where we're having to manage pests. So then the next phase of IPM is discussing the drivers. So why do we have to control these pests? Why does it matter? So there's a whole slew of different things that we consider when we decide that if we're going to need to manage a pest or not. So first and foremost is employee and public safety. So some of those pests we talked about, they can harbor disease. Some of the pests out on, some of the vegetative types of pests can inhibit access. They can house things like rattlesnakes or ticks, or it could be poison oak. So those are the types of things that we need to manage to ensure that district staff can get to our facilities so we can operate them and continue to provide safe drinking water. There are regulatory drivers out there. One key one is the Division of Safety of Dams. We have to make sure that dam faces are clear and low so that staff can go out there, conduct analysis, make sure there aren't any sort of leaks, those sorts of things. Fire access. A lot of cities and counties have specific ordinances and cutback requirements to make sure that property will be protected during fire season. Flood control and drainage. We have facilities that discharge into local waterways, and we need to make sure that when those things are going to be operational, that we're not going to cause flooding because it's impacted with certain types of vegetation and flood control issues. Being able to access our infrastructure so that we can maintain it. Habitat management, so this is really open space areas. You do get invasives at times that come in and will start to disrupt pristine habitat for local species, so that's also one of the drivers that's considered. And then lastly, aesthetics. We do hear from people when they are up against a facility and maybe there's accessibility issues, so we have to deal with that as well. So we know what a pest is, we know where we're working on these things, and now we know where what the drivers are and what forces us to think about these things and why we need to control. So then the next step is to look at our toolbox. Say, what tools do we have? So we have a slew of different things, management strategies that we can choose from. So first and foremost is do nothing. Maybe we can just let something go. Maybe it's not an immediate need or crisis and we can let something grow and continue to evolve on its own without any intervention. There's physical controls, so that's actually going out there and physically removing whatever the pest would be. Those include things like mowers, disking, and actual physically going out and digging things up. Hand labor is done by both district staff, and we also have an agreement in place with Civicor where those folks can come out and also help to remove things. Biological controls. So this includes everything from cattle grazing, which we do frequently on our watershed lands, and goats. Everyone's seen the goats. I was just out at the Oakland Zoo this morning dropping off the kids at camp, and the goats were all over the hill. The goats are more exciting than the tigers and the elephants, hands down. So those are actively being used when they're available. They're not always available. Unfortunately, there's really just one goat company out there, and those goats are in high demand. So they're incredibly popular, but we use them when we can. And then lastly, chemical controls, when these other options aren't available to us and something needs to be addressed in a timely fashion, which includes pesticides and herbicides. So it's a pretty big toolbox. We have a lot of choices. So then the next phase, now that we know what's in our toolbox, is to have a real clear process for selecting a strategy at a given site. So I mentioned earlier that each site is unique. They have individual constraints and complexities, and you have to choose select a strategy that's going to work the best for a given site on a case-by-case basis. So the things that we think about when we're trying to determine the strategy include the biology of the pest in question. There could be more than one pest out there that we're trying to address. The habitat, and it could be a range of habitats in a given area. Site accessibility. Sometimes you simply can't get in a big mower to certain areas really close to critical infrastructure, so you might have to utilize something different. Employee safety and public safety is of utmost concern to us. We want to make sure that the folks that have to go in and maintain are safe when they're doing that, and people that are around the area are going to be safe. Effectiveness. So we also don't want to go out there and have a strategy to go tackle something, and then 2 weeks later it's back, and then we're back and we're just kind of tackling that one spot over and over again, understanding the demands that we have. Okay, and then lastly, cost is a consideration as well. I'm going to blow through a couple of examples. I know a picture's worth 1,000 words, so I just wanted to show you the diversity in the types of areas that we're talking about here. So up front on watershed, just a few pictures. This is one of our rangers out there mowing open grassland areas, one of the strategies that they use. Grazing, I mentioned, so this is when the season allows for it and access is good, they'll do this. This is actually some volunteers that are physically helping to weed. So this is something that we do through natural resources as well. And then prescribed fires. This is something that the rangers use. So you can just see the diversity in the types of environments we're talking about here. Along the aqueduct. So there's some straits here that they don't necessarily have out on watershed. You can see that there's some clearance issues here. We can't get too close to that critical infrastructure. We need to make sure that whatever we're doing immediately around and below that pipe isn't going to affect the infrastructure at all. So there's, they may spray in these types of areas. One more photo of aqueduct. This was just an interesting scenario here. You can see off to the left that plume of smoke. So it was a really good thing that they had clearance here because that was peat moss that just, there was a fire out along the aqueduct there. So fortunately they had gone out and they'd maintained that area to help protect the infrastructure. Here's one example of facility and the diversity that each individual facility can possess. This is our North Reservoir. Up in this area right here, this is the dam face right here, and you can see that this is a combination of strategies being employed at a single site. So here you can see that it's clearly mowed so that they can go in there and check the integrity of the dam. In this area here, it's left open and untouched, and then down here you've got some riprap. So in this area, you really can't use mechanized equipment. So in this space here, they are applying product to make sure that the vegetation is managed. So it's a combination of things. It's not just a single one size fits all across the board. So let's jump to 2015. We had an opportunity to vet the data. This information is reported to the counties per regulatory requirements on a regular basis. So for watershed, upcountry in the East Bay, you can see that the volume used per acre in terms of pesticide product, and its general use pesticide product, is 0.24 for upcountry and 0.04 for the East Bay. This is actually comparable and in fact lower than some of our counterparts locally that also operate watershed lands. Then when you look at Aqueduct, it's about 39 ounces, per acre, and facilities. So we have approximately 300 facilities here in the East Bay, from reservoirs to pump stations to buildings to courtyards, and it's about 25 ounces per acre. So just for context, I think, 128 ounces in a gallon. So that gives you a sense of how much product is being used at these given locations. So just quickly touching on staff training and qualifications, all of our gardeners here in East Bay and all of our maintenance folks along the aqueduct are QACs, or qualified applicator certificate holders. They go through training annually on how to apply this stuff appropriately without having any sort of negative effects, so that it is effective. And then they have continuing education units, so about roughly 20 hours every 2 years, they're getting that training. So I'm going to jump to improvement plan, because we've been working on this internally. We reviewed the IPM program. It was originally written in the late 90s. It's been updated several times since then. We recently conducted a thorough internal review, and we've made some recommendations to enhance the program, including clarification of roles and responsibilities, refining the internal infrastructure, establishing tasks to standardize notifications when applications need to happen, and a slew of other things as well. So we're going to be working to implement those things. We went through that 2015 data, vetted it to get a better sense and be able to trend out what it is that we're doing now. We had a refreshed glyphosate training for those folks that are using that product in the field to go over how to really effectively utilize it on various species. We've engaged a independent third party to come in and review our program with a fresh set of eyes and give us recommendations going forward for how to further enhance and continue to grow this program. And we've reestablished our IPM internal stakeholder committee. So we were meeting annually at the outset of the program. The frequency of those meetings had been less, and so we've reinitiated. We've been meeting on a regular basis, and we continue to do so. So looking forward, the things that we think that we need to do. We really want to go on a site-by-site basis, either categories of sites as a whole that have similar characteristics, or site-by-site, and establish clear objectives for each of those sites and write those down. Document actions for those individual sites to achieve those established goals and objectives. So we need to, that's going to take time. It's going to take time to do that. Because I said, you know, facilities alone, just down here, we've got over 300. So it's going to take a team of folks coming in and doing that work. Improve our data collection by standardizing our methods across the work units. The information's being gathered, but it's not consistent across the board, so we want to establish consistency to make sure we can do that trend analysis going forward. Establish an electronic data management system. Right now it's on hard copy. That'll help to facilitate that data collection. And then document our decision process for establishing and picking the best remedies for a given site. And it's a living, breathing process. The idea is you establish, you implement, you go back, you check it, and you see whether or not you need to make changes on a case-by-case basis. And then lastly, put together a pilot program so that we can start testing alternative products in the field. So we've got recommendations on different things that we can try. We've been talking to some of our sister agencies on the things that they've tried too, but that's one thing that we want to get started here pretty quick. So the things that I just talked about, here's a proposed schedule to get some of these things done. We'd like to get that third-party review done this quarter. We've already started talking to folks. We've got some good feedback. Once that is done, we would then issue the updated description of the program so that it's readily available for folks. Continue to conduct our meetings internally and our IPM meetings to start going through those individual strategies. Get our electronic system up and running. We have a couple things that already exist that we're trying to tweak to start capturing that information a little more quickly. Work on our pilot program by end of year, get that started before the next rainy season. Any discussion on policy change potentially before the end of the year. And then start documenting those processes on an individual site-by-site or category of site basis. That's going to take a while. So we've got Q1, so this time next year is when we would look to get the first iteration of that completed. So last comment, sample IPM policies. There are a lot of organizations out there that do have different policies to help direct where we want to go, or where their organizations want to go, rather. Locally here, the city of Oakland does have a pesticide ban with specific exceptions. The challenge with this that we see right now is that it was very unclear to us what constituted an exception, what the threshold criteria was, and right now, having not had the opportunity to go in and define each of our sites, the level of complexity, the specific details, we could find ourselves in a position where we would be asking or needing exceptions all the time. So at that point, you know, or more often than not, it wouldn't have a lot of value if this was to be implemented immediately. Boulder, Colorado has a policy that had some useful elements, including utilizing the most environmentally sound approach to reduce and eliminate, where possible, the volume and toxicity of chemical pest control treatments. So it's a balanced approach to looking at trying to reduce and eliminate over time and working your way to doing that in a critical thinking way. So that is it. I'm sorry I flew through that. There's a lot of information, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I should take public comment before we do questions.
It's a quick clarification.
No, I really want to do, we have 6 people that need to make public comment. We're going to run out of time. I don't know if we're going to have, you can ask a question anytime.
Okay.
So,
I just wanted to ask if we have a policy, like what is the current policy?
We do not have a policy.
we don't have a policy. We have a program. Okay, we have 6 speakers, and then if there's time, we will take board questions at the conclusion. Please keep your comments to 3 minutes or less so that everyone has an opportunity to speak. First up, I have Isis Farrell.
My name is Isis Farrell. I'm a member of the Coalition to Defend East Bay Forests, but I'm only speaking for myself today. I'm here to comment on your updated IPM plan, which I've not been able to find, even though the agenda indicates that documents related to it can be found on the EBMUD website. Again, we have a problem with transparency about your pesticide policy, something I brought up last year during comments on the watershed management plan when I was unable to find the IPM guidelines referenced. Relevant documents were posted only after several complaints, and then they were inconsistent and misspelled one of the products listed, making it harder for the public to research it. The documents listed 21 products with 16 active ingredients, but EBMUD's reported real-life use in 2015 included an additional 9 pesticide products with 7 additional active ingredients that were not listed in the official IPM documents. The public is entitled to know what chemicals you're using so that we can protect ourselves. Some of us have been injured and are disabled by pesticides, and your pesticide use is an ADA access barrier for us. What stands out most in the staff report for this meeting is that an update to the policy regarding pest management and/or use of pesticides is little more than an afterthought and not even a plan, but only a consideration. Instead of spending the last year eliminating pesticide use and sitting down with your colleagues at the Marin Municipal Water District, which is in the process of doing just that and extended an offer to assist you, your work group wants to set up data management systems to evaluate the volume and toxicity of pesticides applied, which wouldn't be necessary if you just stopped using them. I think it's time for the work group to stop staring at a computer screen and go out into what's left of nature and do some soul searching about how to preserve it rather than kill it. Not just the pesticides are a problem, but the district's destruction of trees under the guise of restoration. From the pesticides you use in our watershed to the ones you add to our water, this district is much too chemically dependent and it needs to stop. You have been notified numerous times by community members about the dangers of the pesticides you use, as well as the chloramine and fluoride you add to the water, including injuries this district was directly responsible for. Some of us can't even drink the water we pay for every month. All we do is flush with it. I will resubmit the extensive toxicology related to your chemical use, which I submitted on the draft watershed management plan last year. What I expect from my water district is to provide me with clean water that's safe and healthy to drink and bathe in. I do not consent to chemicals being added to my water supply that are not easily dissipated or filtered out, nor do I consent to the ongoing poisoning and destruction of vegetation on public lands managed by this district. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Burrow.
And may I give this to you?
Next,
Thank
I
you.
have Mary McAllister.
I'm pleased that the district is evaluating its pesticide policy and practices, and I hope the evaluation will result in improvements in the district's use of pesticides. The district's existing IPM policy looks fine to me. The problem is that the written policy has almost nothing to do with what is actually being done. Here are a few examples of the huge gap between written policy and actual practice in the district's pesticide use. 1, the district's IPM policy says that a central committee will review the district's pesticide use and conduct an annual evaluation. In fact, that committee has not existed since 2002, and there is no record of it ever having evaluated the district's pesticide use. 2, the IPM policy says that pesticide application notices will be posted when pesticides are sprayed, where the public will be exposed. In fact, the district does not post pesticide application notices, even when pesticides are sprayed in residential neighborhoods and on public roads. And your draft revision makes no improvement whatsoever in the paragraph about posting pesticide applications. It is verbatim the same. Number 3, the IPM policy says employees who apply pesticides are required to attend training sessions, yet photographs show that employees do not understand how pesticides work or how they should be applied. Therefore, I am not looking for another written IPM policy. I'm looking for strong commitments to monitor pesticide use and enforce pesticide policy. I'm looking for accountability, not empty words on a piece of paper. Now, you've been shown some numbers here that are quite mystifying to me, because California state law requires the district to report its pesticide use to the county agriculture departments. And so the public records with which we work and analyze are a matter of legal public records. And they have no relationships whatsoever to the numbers that you were shown earlier this morning. In 2015, the county agricultural departments report that the district used about 1,000 gallons of herbicide in 2015 and they were applied in about 650 different applications. So, I don't know what this vetting consists of, but if it didn't involve the legal department to which you are required to report, it is of no meaning whatsoever. So I, of course, wanted to say other more helpful things this morning and have been distracted by the information that I was given late in the game. I've run out of time?
Yeah, your time is up.
All right, fine. Then I'd like to just hand in what I had hoped to say until I was hit with a lot of late in the game data that I wasn't ready to.
Thank you. Next up, Wanda Workington? Workington.
Yes. I'm a ordinary citizen who's thinking for myself. And I think you all need to start thinking for yourselves. I'd like to point out the madness of this. Glyphosate is being sprayed all over the northern Northern American wildlands. And the reason is for invasive species. And it's also being sprayed in New York City on the public parks. UC Berkeley sports facilities. These are just a few things, but I had a friend way back who said she was going to use some Roundup on a plant that she just couldn't get rid of in her garden. And I thought, isn't that poison, I said? And she said, well, it only kills weeds. Well, you're ascribing intelligence to a pesticide. The pesticide, some people believe, and I find offensive that you define what a pest is. Some scientists think humans are pests. Oppenheimer, for instance. But this is like, and have you noticed that there are all over the world, all over our country, water supplies are being polluted with these pesticides. And I'd like to say another thing. Every single human being here has glyphosate in their system because it's being used rampantly. Because experts, who are these experts? Why are you listening? You are humans who think, who care about people, who are intelligent, who are kind, or used to be. You've lost your minds and you're enabling policies that are suicidal, planticidal, homicidal, genocidal. It's insane. And there are I just want to give an example, record numbers of millennials have Crohn's disease. And that's what these pesticides cause. Why? By the way, I have lost my tonsils because of the madness back in the day. My mother has better immune system than I do. The tonsils are the largest lymph node in your body. So lucky for the people who didn't have it happen to them. And you people need to start thinking on your feet as individual citizens of this earth. And by the way, the Crohn's disease thing, adult diaper sales have surpassed child diaper sales. In case you don't know what this stuff does to people.
Bladder cancer.
And you have to think about the repercussions of it. It isn't your job, this is the way this stuff happens. It's mindless, doing your job very well. I love weeds myself. I see these things that are being called weeds. One weed is another person's healer. I've been healed by it. I grab a piece of plantain and I slap it on a wound and by gum, it heals it. You maybe don't believe it. I used to think, oh, herbal medicine. But really, okay, I've done.
Thank you. Mary Mitchell?
Hi. On the glyphosate, on the glyphosate, you're using glyphosate all over the place, and we stopped it in Berkeley in the 80s because we found out they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. So what it is the glyphosate was supposed to stay put. And the city of Berkeley said, oh, this is this wonderful stuff, but they go to Totland and spray it all around the fences, which you can just so easily little applicator cut down around fences and around trees. There's usually another solution. But anyway, so we formed this group, Parents United for Health, and we haven't been using it. But one of the worst things is they how it spreads and how that affects your trihalomethanes and other chemicals get in water. What happens, you use glyphosate, kills the weeds, but it also kills all the little soil organisms. And what happens then when the wind blows? So the glyphosate spreads all over. That's why almost close to 100% of people have glyphosate in them, pregnant women and everything. But anyway, it spreads into your water system. And that's where, when the glyphosate, whatever that does, I won't tell you, I can't tell you, but the dirt, the soil that it's not held together, that good functional soil, that's going to blow in there, and that's going to mix with your chlorine. So I brought one thing today. I don't understand it too well, but I gave it to the gentleman back here. There's an alternative to chlorine, so the chlorine molecules get used up and they don't make the trihalomethanes and things. So you might want to look at that. But the main thing, you don't want to use these pesticides around there because they're going to destroy the soil that will blow and also wash down with all these chemicals to the bay. Terrible things are happening in the bay. You know, the little fish have more trouble than the big fish, and we were told the little fish that are low in the food chain. So the thing is, here now we have this trihalomethane thing. If you're using pesticides up there, you're creating stuff that's blowing into the water table, and so you want to figure a way to keep the greens under control, but to not use these pesticides are terrible. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Marge Hall. And is there anybody else that's going to want to submit public comment? Because we are literally, please fill out, did you fill out a card? Please come and fill out a card and submit it to the secretary so that we can get you on the list. Marge Hall.
Hi. No disrespect to the staff working on this. I actually really appreciate the effort you've been putting into this, and I know, it's a hard job, it's complicated. But I have a fear that this effort is futile, because IPM programs generally are weak tools to reduce pesticide use, especially if they're done kind of on the side of your other staff responsibilities. They tend to mostly provide institutional cover, otherwise known as greenwashing. I don't think much is going to change, except that maybe you'll keep better records. You'd be much better off adopting a zero pesticide policy. A zero tolerance policy is possible. I think the public and all of the plants and animals on your land would be better off too. That said, here's a little feedback. In terms of any written policy, I think it should be very clear that the burden of proof should be on those who want to employ poison. All pesticide use should be by special request each and every time, and they should go through a very vigorous process of scrutiny to justify that this choice is a last resort. It should be rigorous and well documented. In your annual reports, I think you should specifically document in a great detail the non-poison alternatives you're using and why these means are not effective when you choose to use pesticides. I also think you need to modify your definition of pest. Categorical definitions of plants as invasive, non-native, unwanted, or weeds, and therefore as pests, will only lead you to be reflexive and thoughtless in your use of pesticides. This is not a war. It takes a fair amount of expertise to understand what the underlying issues are that are causing plant or animal colonization and how to manage healthy lands organically. Just ask an organic farmer. In fact, maybe that's who you should be hiring to oversee these operations, an organic farmer. If you did that, the public would have a lot more confidence in the success of this endeavor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, last call I have two more people on my list, and last call for anybody else that wants to speak. Okay. Mary Sue Menz? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to speak for someone who couldn't come today, Beth DeVore, who is a naturalist and has studied flora and fauna for many years. She says she's been a member of the Bay Area for over 40 years and has spent a lot of her time in the East Bay Hills. And I'm going to add a few things after if I have time. But she says her concern here is safety. Before talking about fire, why not start with something that's in East Bay Mud's power to do, and that's to stop putting unnecessary poisons into our drinking water that we are forced to pay for. An example would be fluoride, which is an extremely toxic waste product of the fertilizer industry, and it causes cancer, brain and bone damage, and other things. People who believe the con that it helps teeth could decide to poison themselves without subjecting everyone else to it in our drinking water. And I can add an aside that apparently it's bad for the pipes too, the physical pipes. I learned that in the 60s when it was being debated. Back to Bev. We should not be forced to drink chloramine, which is far more toxic than chlorine and even kills fish. At least when chlorine was put into our water against our will, we could leave it out for a day to dissipate. But we do not know why East Bay Mud made this decision, but she thinks, like fluoride, it's the money. And there's absolutely no use to use any poison in East Bay Mud land, which ends up, as we've already heard, in the reservoirs, streams, lakes, bay, etc. We already have carcinogenic glyphosate in our bodies. We've heard that. Also, there's been a suit, this is not part of BEB, a suit against Monsanto, where they've discovered that glyphosate is a poison that definitely is detrimental to humans. It causes cancer, Crohn's disease, and other things. And it will harm animals, plants and animals, including humans. And you talk about grazing, they're not going to graze where the poisons have been because it'll kill the goats. Okay, so don't we have enough cancer and chronic illness already, and why do we need more in this case? Bev suggests that the water district in Marin Municipal Water District is an example of why there is no reason to use any poisons. And you should look at that because they have resolved a lot of these problems and they're doing just fine without the poisons. We need every tree we have, regardless of its origin, to clean and cool our cities. And the misinformed vendetta against our trees and our parklands is wrong.
Ms. Mann,
It's also on East Bay Mud. All right, thank you.
Wrap up, thank you. Okay, our last speaker, Marla Schmoll. Where's your card?
I didn't put your card.
What's your name?
Stephanie Thomas.
Did it get put at the back? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. It got put in the wrong part of the stack. Marla?
Okay, so again, as an old one, I tend to look at my stories of tonsillectomies and things like that. I remember when DDT was considered absolutely safe. It was everywhere.
Right.
Okay. And I also remember, when the difference between adult behavior and child behavior, one of the big differences was that adults smoked. And as children, we had little candy cigarettes with a little red thing on the end so that we could pretend to be adults and be grown up. Okay? Through all of this, people insisted, experts, whatever, that it was safe. And finally, I had a Marine friend that I met at the VA hospital who was sent into an area where Agent Orange had been sprayed in Vietnam. He had a horrible life. He ended up dying in my arms. I think those of us who were around can recall that for years the government insisted that no service person had been exposed in any way that could at all be harmful from Agent Orange. So I just want to say, in terms of the pesticides, let's be very careful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Schmoll, Stephanie Thomas?
Thank you, and I agree with Mary Sue, Marg, and Marla. And I have been, I've been busy with other things lately, working in community gardens, and we're so careful about what we use to keep our plants healthy. And
we don't use any chemicals for sure. And also, as part of that effort, connected with permaculturists, we learned through different programs what affects our soil. You know, like there was a program that's coming up again, Soil Not Oil, that people speak about this and they talk about the harm both that these chemicals do in our guts, but also in the soil and the animals that eat them. So my dad was in the Department of Agriculture, Washington, D.C., Maryland, where I grew up, and then up here in Albany, the center there. And way back, he used DDT, because that's what they used. And of course, people have found that that has not worked and still around. So I just want to strengthen the idea that we don't need to put these chemicals in the soil. In fact, maybe Marilee has spoken to this, I don't know, but she left me a message about the effect when the soil has these chemicals and then these other things like chloride or chloramine come in. There's all these processes that happen that bring about some of these problems you've had in the East Bay Hills with that T something or other thing that's announced. Yes. So these things are all connected. And there are other means if a little tree has to be cut down or a big tree that falls, to break it down or whatever, or to break out the sprouts if necessary. But you can use mushrooms, and I think you've tested some of that over the hill. So I just would strengthen, remember the precautionary principle, and think of all of us, and especially our creatures, from the ground up to us, the people who walk there with their pets, their dogs, and the little salamanders and things that we're trying to protect. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to, we're over our time. We have actually 2 more committee meetings before we have a closed session at 11. So we are on a tight clock. I do want to thank and appreciate everyone's comments and thank the staff for the work that has gone in so far. I do believe we are moving in a direction to dramatically reducing our pesticide use, and that I was actually quite pleased to see and we'll deal with whatever discrepancies that were raised earlier in comments, that our actual use in the watershed is currently quite low, and I think there's more information that we'll appreciate at our next report about where those events are happening and how close or not they are to the watershed and why, and et cetera. I look forward to actually establishing a board policy in this area that is not lip service or cover or greenwashing. My very first science report when I was 11 was on the effects of DDT after working my way through Silent Spring a long time ago. So this is an issue that I care about and concerned about, and I think all of us share that concern, and all of you share that concern. So with that, keep at it and encourage board members to talk to staff if they have specific things that they'd like to see out of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Adjourned.